In section 4, part 4 of the introduction, Laruelle continues with his explication of his 5 criteria of demarcation between his science of ordinary humans, or theory, and philosophy and its avatars, the human sciences, and the social sciences. So once again, to keep in mind the 5 criteria of demarcation, the science of ordinary humans differs from philosophy in terms of 5 criteria: naivete, reality or absoluteness or anhypotheticality, theoreticalness. The science of ordinary man is theoretical rather than practical. It's descriptive rather than constructive, and it's human rather than anthropological. So today in this video we're dealing with number 4, descriptive. So if we're following the sequence of criteria, the one just before number 3 is that, which may seem just obvious from a normal point of view, normal in a Greek unitary sense, that the science of ordinary man is theoretical. But from the point of view of the list, it seems to stand out. When we talk about naivete, reality rather than hypotheses, or the real rather than hypotheses, to say that it's theoretical or theory does seem to be in tension with these first 2. And then we go back to descriptive rather than constructive. So we seem to go back to the same general spirit as in 1 and 2. But because we've had theoretical just before, we can know that descriptive doesn't mean empirical description. Descriptive does mean already, always already, or pre-primary already, theoretical. So it's not going to be a question of empirical description, which would be the counter value, which would be constructive, because it would be the mobilization of the circular encyclopedia of known predicates. So description here is going to mean something else than empirical description. So for criterion number 4, thus return to its essence, real theory, undetermined by philosophical operations or prejudices, is a non-positional contemplation of, in parentheses, immediate givens, or of, in parentheses, unreflective transcendental experiences. So he's sort of summing up everything that he's said before, but maybe it's reasonable to comment on this idea of real theory that deals with experiences, unreflective transcendental experiences, and not empirical facts, which you could call experiences in a different sense. So what does that mean in terms of reading this book, either by yourself or as I am reading the book, reading and thinking it at the same time for these videos? So what it doesn't mean is made clear by the terms of the third paragraph of the foreword. It's true that when I come to read this book, I come with a certain passion for philosophy and for concepts, a passion for the work of Laruelle. I'm inspired by the work of Laruelle and by what I can find in it. I'm also disappointed, and you're not getting anywhere if you're not disappointed at the same time. But here we're talking about empirical disappointment. These are the all too human, and not the human, the all too human experiences that come from any involvement with philosophy. So it's not a question of this sort of passion and disappointment of the anti-philosophical vivacity that we can bring to reading this book, that will be part of the motivation for reading the book, as curiosity will be, but a passionate curiosity. All those are present, and they are good, but they're not up to the transcendental level that Laruelle is trying to begin with and follow through with. So from that point of view, from the point of transcendental experiences, I begin my reading. I am a solitude. Maybe the is too much. I am solitude, I am a solitude. So the authorities don't exist. I'm reading, not even Laruelle doesn't exist when I read this book, when I'm reading it with as a transcendental experience. I'm a solitude, I'm reading the book, I am open to the conceptual plane, which is the plane of human experience, and I'm reading the book as an experience, and as at the same time the theory of that experience. The book is its own theory, and I, reading the book, am the theory of the experience of reading the book. Otherwise, we're just in the circular domain of philosophy. So when we're talking about real theory, we're also talking about it being experienced. So the science of ordinary humans is theoretical and experiential, but not in the sense of empirical experience. So it's undetermined by philosophical operations or prejudices. We saw at the end of section 3, or part 3, that the cogito and the transcendental ego as examples, but we could take other examples. Difference is another example. Desire, as the Lacanians talk about it, as if it were a first principle. These are concepts elevated to the rank of principles or first principles, uncovered or constructed by means of philosophical operations. So we're thinking without those sort of first principles. We're thinking, theorizing. We are theorizing as we are contemplating itself, only in a subject-object way. So we are theorizing without the prejudices induced by philosophical operations. And in that case, real theory is a non-positional contemplation of immediate givens or of unreflective transcendental experiences. So it's non-positional, which is a virtual synonym for non-thetic. It's non-positional because, as we explained in part 2, it's not dealing in posits. It's not dealing in hypotheses, because the rigor and the humanity are together in reconciliation at the same time. So we have to go with that for the moment and take Laruelle's word for it. It may be that a good way of understanding Laruelle's point is that it's a sort of Gödelian point. I'll get to that when I get to the next part of the sentence. So it's a non-positional, non-positing, non-hypothetical contemplation of immediate givens. The of is in parentheses because the contemplation is not a subject faced with objects that will be immediate givens. The contemplation is directly the immediate givens. Or a contemplation of, in parentheses, unreflective transcendental experiences. So the contemplation is not a subject faced with unreflective transcendental experiences. The contemplation that we are is unreflective transcendental experiences. That is to say, unreflective, we can come back to this word, which may be a sort of Gödelian or self-reference point, insofar as we're not doing the theory of experiences in a subject-object sense, insofar as the theory is the experiences, or the contemplation is the experiences, is the givens. It's not a question of reflection. Reflection, if it existed, would be one experience among the experiences, and that would rule out reflecting on the reflection. That would be one experience, but it's not universally present or primarily present in what is called thinking. Reflection is something else, and as ordinarily understood, it's a philosophical construct. It's a highly constructed result of philosophical operations, and as such, reflection takes us away from the experience and makes us cycle around in the circle of known predicates or new combinations of the known predicates. So it's not getting us into an immediate contact or an immediate identity, rather, with the real. These are the material of this science, which describes the content of the finite phenomenal experience of man and his relations to the grand authoritarian attributes, which is the world, without intervening in them. So there's this word, material. These are the material of this science. We have to be very careful with this word, material, because he's going to use it later to describe the material in the world that is the occasional material for the science of ordinary human beings, insofar as it unilateralizes the world as secondary. So the occasional material is the material in the world that the world would like to work on and transform and produce products out of. That's why it's raw. And that the science of humans uses, if that's the right word, or rather it assigns its use by unilateralizing it as material in the world. But here, the material is not that. So it's, as far we're not getting a worked out opposition later in the book, but as far as the argument goes, the material here refers not to material in the world, but to immediate givens and unreflective transcendental experiences, and so it's not occasional material. It's in the language of Laruelle for the moment. You can't even call it raw material. It's material, neither raw nor transformed, but prior to that distinction, as these are the materials, or the material. There's a play from the beginning of this paragraph that we saw already in the forward, between singular and plural in a way that can be disconcerting or intriguing. On the first page of the forward towards the bottom, the book is an essay towards a thought of the one or of individuals. One singular, individuals plural. It begins with the one or minorities. One singular, minorities plural, identified. So this may be a way of describing this book. He describes it as a treatise of solitudes. So even that is funny, solitudes with an S. So it's a treatise of the one. One could almost say a treatise of the ones, but it's a treatise of minorities. So already there, the notion of singular and plural is not quite up to the conceptual grammar of the one and minorities. Similarly, we're talking about experiences that are the material. That's okay. We can see material as some sort of generic term that subsumes experiences, but we're still having this. We could have said materials of this science, so we're still having this interplay between singular and plural. Okay, this science describes the content of the finite phenomenal experience of man and his relations to the grand authoritarian attributes. Attributes, we're here in the same thought as when he talks about universal predicates. We talk about subject and predicate, substance and attribute, but attributes here are history, language, power, etc. So we're talking about, he could have put the same thing as in part 3, where he talks about theoria as a predicate. All these are attributes or predicates, and man has a relation to these authoritarian predicates, but they're part of the world and of philosophy and Greco-Unitarian thought, and the primary phenomenon is man's finite, or humans' finite phenomenal experience. So this science describes his relations to the grand authoritarian attributes, plural, and to their totality, which is the world, singular. So we saw that as well earlier on, this identification of the one with the totality, or of the totality with the one, is a philosophical identification constitutive of the world and not of the biography of ordinary man. Without intervening in them. And he goes on, the theory of man is not a theoretical practice, an intervention into the object and a transformation of that object. So we have intervention. This has already been analyzed in the previous section, where he talks about how philosophy is a mixture of logico-real knowledge that organizes the intervention of thought into the real to make the real occur. So it's the same exclusion that is going on here. The theory of man is not a theoretical practice. A theoretical practice is a sort of logico-real mixture that the science of ordinary humans excludes. And it's not an intervention, because intervention is the operation of mixture. It by intervening, it is a theory and a practice at the same time, and it makes the real occur, or that's its intention, but the only real that it can make occur is a logico-real, and so not the real as it is, or in its real identity. It is rather a non-positional but also non-deforming description of positions, philosophical, for example. So it's a non-positional description of positions. The positions are philosophical and scientific in the sense of the human sciences, but the science of ordinary humans is non-positional, because philosophy's positions are by means of the cyclical encyclopedia of known predicates and the constructions we can make out of those known predicates. So we take our position for materialism or against. We take our position on a particular thesis of what generates signification, or what is the essence of the psyche. These are all positions, and the science of human beings is a non-positional description of positions. So it doesn't endorse and so it doesn't place itself within any of these positions. It's something else, it's something outside. Passive thought, but not before an object, where passivity is the counterpart to a production. Okay, there's a translation problem, if you want, or a lack of a skillful solution. Before is in italics, and later on the first line of page 15, so just a little further on, we have before in italics again. But in French, they're two different words. It's true that in English before has two meanings, a sort of spatial meaning and a temporal meaning. And in this first occurrence of before, passive thought, so we're identifying real theory, real science as passive thought, but it's as usual, we need a qualification to get it outside the circle of philosophy. So what he would have to say, but he'll have to explain it, is passive thought that is nothing but passive, which means it's not passive before an object, so before works, in front of an object, or near the bottom of page 14, it's a passive thought or a science that has no vis-à-vis. So, as he defines it, not before an object. Remember, object is what has been made of the real to put it vis-à-vis a subject. And as before, when I encourage people to use bric-a-brac at least 10 times in a week, I encourage you to use vis-à-vis more often. I think it's very good. So he defines what it would be to be passive thought before an object, and that would be passivity as the counterpart to a production. So as a counterpart to some activity, some active process of transformation, where passivity would be the passive counterpart to that possible activity. So it's not a question of that. It's a science that has no vis-a-vis. So each time he wants to aim at what he's trying to say, he has to qualify to rid us of the normal sort of prejudices or ordinary associations that could go with these ideas. So it has no vis-a-vis, and this does not mean that it's idealist, that it's just pure thought generating the world in some sense. It does not mean that it is devoid of reality or materials with an S. Just because I'm interested in this use of the S, I want to look it up. devoid or deprived of reality or of materials. Okay, we've got an S there, as I argued that we could have had an S higher up. So, once again, the precautions about using the word material are reiterated. It's not devoid of reality or materials, but these materials are not in the form of objects. That would be vis-à-vis a subject. So it's not idealist in that sense. It does have materials, and they're the materials and itself are in identity. The materials are the unreflective transcendental experiences that the science is a contemplation of, in parentheses. It is content to describe strictly immanent phenomenal experiences before, here in French it's avant, whereas before it was devant, before and outside of all unitary philosophical prejudice. Okay, it's avant, and it's not, so it's temporal, but it's not empirical temporality. It's not within time that we would be born outside authorities and with all these transcendental experiences, and then we would come to our unitary philosophical prejudices. That's a possible picture, but it's not the picture that Laruelle is trying to draw here. That will be an empirical question, maybe even a cross-cultural question, but he's using before in terms of conceptual temporality, in terms of primacy. Remember that the world is to be derived as a secondary activity. Philosophy is to be derived or unilateralized as a secondary activity by theory. So it's before of logical or conceptual time, if you want. In particular, outside of any phenomenological prejudice. It emphasizes phenomena as immediate givens rather than as still transcendent intuitions. So I don't want to go into his critique of phenomenology because it's done elsewhere, and I think it becomes less and less important as time goes by. That's his origin story as a superhero of science, of ordinary men, but doesn't have to be our origin story. The point to retain there is that these intuitions of uncovered by phenomenology can never be pure intuitions. They are constructs constructed by means of philosophical operations, and insofar as they're given primacy and primary logical weight, they're transcendent. He says still transcendent because there's a gesture in something like the right direction, but it's a failed gesture. They fail immanence, these intuitions and these phenomenologies based on them. So they fail immanence, they're still transcendent. Finite thought gives up reflection, analysis, and construction. That's what we've been seeing all along. Entrusting itself to the unreflective, to phenomenality devoid of phenomenological operations. So there's the operations being cited as the problem with phenomenology. And so how can you get to the unreflective? By means of reflection. So that's a good point, but the same point could be made to Laruelle. How can you get to the unreflected? By means of reflection. You're going to be using reflection in some way. His way out at this point is that he's not doing reflection, he's doing science, and science is not reflective. But in fact, this identification with science as an authority guaranteeing non-reflectiveness will be abandoned by him in principles of non-philosophy, for example. So we have his critique of phenomenology, but at this point we have the programmatic proclamation that he escapes this objection by being in immediate givens, and a reinforcement or a redoubling of that, I would call it nonetheless a thesis of immediate givens, by a second thesis that this is part of his scientificity, and we may want to accept one without the other, which seems to be what Laruelle strives to do later on in Philosophy 3. We may want to accept the immediate givens without construing them as identical with scientificity or with science. That's a possible objection to his thought at this point. Phenomenal givens are not remainders, they are that which is straightaway real. Okay, if you're going to get to the givens by a long process of reflection, you're just contaminating things more and more. You're not getting to greater purity. You're getting to something that is defined as pure. You're getting to something that is defined as sort of rock bottom or the hard rock of first principles. But by the mere fact of having to go through all these operations, you're getting a product, a construct, and not a given. So the givens, in a way, you're making your philosophical operations more important than the immediate givens, which what remains once you've gone through your sophisticated, non-naive, your sophisticated process of philosophical operations and constructions. So it's self-defeating to proceed like that, according to Laruelle. You have to be and begin with the immediate givens, the immediate unreflective transcendental experiences. So phenomenal givens possess the power not only to possibilize but to really ground the latent phenomenology that is the essence of unitary thought. So ground is also found, it's fondé in French. So this idea that philosophy possibilizes is what we saw in the last part, 3.3, that we have this cyclical encyclopedia of predicates, of known predicates and their combinations, and all that can give is possibilities. We can entertain possibilities, but we can't. We can take position. That's the positionality on one selection of these possibilities as against the rest. We can endorse and validate this selection of possibilities, but we can't ground it. We will, in terms of philosophy, we will always be in a realm of possibilities and not in the realm of real finite human experience. So, the phenomenal givens are the way out of this circle. They possess the power to really ground the latent phenomenology that is the essence of unitary thought. So they ground the latent phenomenology that is the essence of unitary thought. So the idea is that unitary thought, whether it is phenomenology or not, has or subtends a latent phenomenology. There's a necessity of working with givens that can be unearthed or produced by philosophical operations. But the problem with a given is it's a stopping point to argument. If it's given inside philosophy, one can always say, but why do you stop there? It's always possible to imagine further explanations or different possibilities. So this non-grounded latent phenomenology, not grounded within philosophy, can be grounded by means of Laruelle's real phenomenal givens, according to him. Once again, that's a pretty grand claim that he has, or because he is, phenomenal givens that really ground, and not just possibilize, but give as a possibility, the latent phenomenological givens of unitary thought. This is why this treatise of ordinary man is made up of theorems, remember they're human theorems, that are transcendental and not empirical. So the givens are not empirical. That already is a strong distinction to make. So the theorems, which are theorems of human experience, are transcendental and not empirical. So you're not meant to go out in the world and look for the experience that confirms the theorems. So you're not meant to go out and even intellectually go out while sitting in your study and reading books and looking online or going and talking to people. You're not going to find the proof of these theorems in other philosophy, I want to say in philosophy or in the human sciences or even in the physical sciences. He's going to relativize that I think a page later in this book, when he's going to talk about, give a hint that quantum theory may be a way of describing the type of thought that he's trying to elaborate here, but one is just a hint and not worked out as in the later books, so it's just a seed. And two, it's not so much the content, ultimately empirical content of quantum theory that counts, but the way of thought. So even there, that confirms this idea. It's not empirical in the sense of looking at the world. It's not empirical in the sense of you can run across it. In the world, you could run across empirical observations or empirically based or confirmed theories, such as the physical sciences, that would constitute proof of or evidence for the theorems. You can run into other ways of thinking, but that's a transcendental running into. People can tell you stuff, according to Laruelle, people could tell you stuff that's interesting, but it's not a proof. But people can, and that's where the solitude is plural and not just singular. People can present or impart transcendental ways of thought. But that's part of the transcendental experiences that the book, which is trying to deal with all the transcendental experiences in order, that sort of encounter is a transcendental encounter and is part of what the book is talking about, rather than outside confirmation of the book. These are less the eyes of the soul than the soul describing itself in its radical individual immanence. That's what we said from the beginning. The book is in fact the soul, if you want, the absolute, the one, contemplating itself, or self-contemplating, if we understand the hyphen as identity. The theorems merely describe phenomena lived by ordinary man, phenomena that are invisible to philosophy and to its phenomenology as a matter of principle. So normally phenomena are taken to be appearances, what appears. But here, what appears only within the new paradigm. Within the old paradigm, they're invisible. So the old paradigm either talks about phenomena all the time, or even when it doesn't talk about phenomena, it presupposes a latent phenomenology. But the phenomena that Laruelle describes, to use a metaphor, are like the dark matter that explain everything in the world that can't be explained by the ordinary laws of the world, but that are everywhere, that is everywhere invisible within the world. That is an image of what he could be meaning, but these phenomena are there, they're lived by us, but they're invisible to philosophy, they're invisible to the human scientists, they're invisible to the politicians and the sociologists and the anthropologists, but they're not visible to us by means of the theorems. They are described to us, or we describe them to ourselves, and that's what the theorems are. Okay, these phenomena are invisible to philosophy and its phenomenology as a matter of principle. This idea of principle has come up regularly already in the text. So he's proposing theory without principles, and so a grounding or a foundation without principles. Normally, when you think of foundation, you think of finding first principles, but for Laruelle, as soon as you have principles, you have separation between, or a demarcation between what is visible in terms of those principles and what is real but invisible. And Laruelle accepts what you can see with principles. He's not refusing science, human sciences. He's not refusing philosophy as such, but he's placing them, unilateralizing them as secondary. So visibility is not denied, but there's something else that is invisible as soon as we introduce principles. So Laruelle does talk about his thought as providing a foundation, but it's a foundation without principles, because principles automatically introduce and induce a mediation, whereas Laruelle considers that the only foundation is the immediate experience of the one, and that is not in itself a principle, or as he sometimes says, is not strictly speaking a principle, but a transcendental, unreflective, immediate given.